They dismissed her as just another mechanic who cleaned planes and fixed engines. Someone who worked hard for minimum wage. But when disaster struck at cruise altitude, 2 Raptor fighters scrambled from the nearest base. Then the radio crackled with her call sign, Shadow Hawk. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The maintenance hangar smelled of oil and metal. Sarah Chen wiped her hands on her work pants and checked the hydraulic line one more time. Perfect seal. She had been working on commercial aircraft for 3 years now, and she took pride in every repair, every inspection, every bolt she tightened. "Hey, Chen. You almost done with that 737, her supervisor called from across the hangar. 5 minutes, Sarah replied, making her final checks. Nobody at Pacific Airlines knew about her past. They saw a quiet mechanic who showed up early, stayed late, and never complained. They didn't know that before she wore these grease-stained coveralls, she had worn a flight suit with captain's bars. They didn't know her call sign had once been spoken with respect across military bases worldwide. Shadow Hawk. That name belonged to another life. Sarah finished her work and signed off on the repair log. Another plane ready to fly safely. That was what mattered now. Not the glory, not the recognition, just keeping people safe. She had learned that lesson the hard way. 3 years ago, she had been Captain Sarah Chen, one of only 12 female F-22 Raptor pilots in the United States Air Force. She had flown combat missions, test flights, and training exercises that pushed both her and her aircraft to their limits. She had earned medals, commendations, and the respect of every pilot who flew with her. Then she had seen something she couldn't ignore. During a routine training mission, she had witnessed another pilot, the son of a 3-star general, make a dangerous mistake that nearly caused a mid-air collision. When she reported it through proper channels, she expected an investigation and additional training for the pilot. Instead, the general had used his influence to bury the report. When Sarah pushed back and insisted on filing a formal safety complaint, suddenly she was the one under investigation. Questions about her judgment, her mental state, her ability to handle pressure. The whisper campaign was subtle but effective. She was given a choice: accept an early retirement with full benefits and sign a non-disclosure agreement, or face a long investigation that would destroy her reputation and likely end her career anyway. She chose retirement, unable to fight a system designed to protect its own. The NDA prevented her from explaining what had really happened. Most people assumed she had washed out, couldn't handle the pressure, or had some kind of breakdown. She let them think whatever they wanted. The truth was locked away behind legal agreements and military secrecy. Without the ability to fly commercially due to the circumstances of her retirement, she had turned to maintenance work. Her technical knowledge was extensive, her security clearances were still active, and she needed to stay close to aviation. If she couldn't fly, at least she could keep aircraft safe. "Chen, you got time to help with the engine inspection on Gate 7? Another mechanic, Tommy Rodriguez, waved from across the hangar. "Sure thing." Sarah grabbed her toolbox and headed over. Tommy was a good guy, about 10 years older than Sarah, with 2 kids and a mortgage. He treated her like an equal, never condescending, never assuming she couldn't handle heavy work because she was a woman. She appreciated that. "This compressor blade is giving me trouble," Tommy said, pointing into the engine. "Can you get a better angle from the other side?" Sarah climbed up and examined the blade carefully. "It's cracked. Hairline, but it's there. We need to replace it." Tommy sighed. "That's going to delay the flight." "Better delayed than crashed," Sarah said simply. "You got that right." Tommy called the supervisor to report the finding. This was Sarah's life now. Finding cracks, replacing parts, signing off on safety checks. It was honest work, important work. She told herself that every day. At 6 in the evening, Sarah clocked out and headed to the employee parking lot. Her old truck started on the second try, and she drove home through rush-hour traffic to her small apartment. She microwaved leftover Chinese food, showered off the day's grime, and settled onto her couch with a book. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother, David. "Mom's asking when you're coming to visit. She misses you." Sarah typed back, "Maybe next month. Work is busy." The truth was, she avoided family gatherings. Too many questions about why she left the Air Force, why she was working as a mechanic when she had been such a promising pilot. Her parents had been so proud when she earned her wings, and now they didn't understand what had happened. The NDA prevented her from explaining, so there was just awkward silence and disappointment. The next morning, Sarah was back in the hangar at 6 a.m. She had a full schedule: pre-flight inspection on a 737, post-flight check on an Airbus A320, and a complete engine service on another 737 that had been showing unusual vibration readings. She was elbow-deep in the engine when the hangar supervisor, Bill Matthews, walked over with a clipboard. "Chen, I need you on flight 2847 today." Sarah looked up, confused. "I'm not scheduled for flight duty." "I know, but we're short-handed. Tom called in sick, and we need someone to ride along to San Francisco to pick up a ferry flight back. You'll be the only maintenance person on board. Just a precaution in case anything comes up during the flight." Sarah's heart skipped. She hadn't been on a commercial flight as anything other than a passenger since her retirement. "Bill, I'm a mechanic, not a flight engineer. You've got more technical knowledge than anyone else here. The pilots know you'll be on board. It's just a safety measure. You'll be in the jump seat. Easy day, and you'll be back by tonight." Sarah wanted to refuse, but she needed this job. "Okay. What time?" "Flight leaves at 10. Gate 12. 2 hours later, Sarah was walking down the jet bridge in her maintenance uniform, carrying her small toolbox and a tablet with the aircraft's maintenance history. The flight attendant smiled politely at her as she entered the cockpit. "You must be our maintenance observer," the captain said, extending his hand. "Captain Rick Morrison." Sarah Chen, she shook his hand, careful not to grip too hard. "And I'm First Officer Amanda Price," the younger pilot in the right seat said cheerfully. "Nice to have some backup on board." Sarah settled into the jump seat behind the first officer and buckled in. She had sat in jump seats before, but always as a visiting military pilot observing procedures. Never as a mechanic. The cockpit felt familiar and foreign at the same time. The instruments, the switches, the rhythm of the pre-flight checklist, it all brought back memories she had tried to bury. "Maintenance, this is flight 2847, ready for pushback," Captain Morrison radioed. The ground crew responded, and Sarah felt the aircraft move backward, away from the gate. The auxiliary power unit hummed, the engines started with their familiar whine, and they began taxiing toward the runway. Sarah watched the pilots work. They were competent, professional, working through their checklists with practiced ease. Captain Morrison had a calm voice, the kind that would reassure passengers during turbulence. First Officer Price was sharp, catching a minor altitude readback error from air traffic control and correcting it smoothly. "Pacific 2847, cleared for takeoff runway 24 left, the tower controller said. "Cleared for takeoff 24 left, Pacific 2847, Morrison responded. The engine spooled up, and Sarah felt the acceleration press her back into the seat. The familiar feeling of takeoff, the moment when the aircraft left the ground and became something more than metal and fuel. She had missed this feeling more than she wanted to admit. They climbed through scattered clouds, leveling off at 36,000 feet. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the flight attendants began their service. Sarah unbuckled but stayed in the jump seat, watching the instruments out of habit. 40 minutes into the flight, somewhere over Central California, everything changed. Sarah heard it first, a subtle change in the engine tone, a slight vibration that shouldn't be there. Her trained ear picked it up instantly. She leaned forward. "Captain, are you seeing any unusual readings on engine number 2? Morrison glanced at his instruments. Everything looks normal. Why? I'm hearing something. A vibration frequency that's off. Price checked her instruments more carefully. EGT is slightly elevated. Within limits, but higher than it should be. Morrison frowned. Could be nothing, but let's keep an eye on it. 30 seconds later, the engine fire warning light illuminated with a loud chime. Engine fire, number 2. Price called out. Morrison's hands moved immediately. Engine fire checklist, number 2 engine. Sarah watched them work, her mind automatically running through the same procedures. Throttle to idle, fuel lever to cut off, fire handle pull, fire extinguisher discharge. They were doing everything correctly, but Sarah could see the stress on their faces. The fire light went out after the first extinguisher bottle discharged, but the engine was shut down. They were flying on one engine now. Pacific 2847, declaring an emergency, Morrison radio to air traffic control. We've had an engine fire, number 2 engine is shut down. Requesting priority handling and direct routing to the nearest suitable airport. Pacific 2847, emergency declared. Nearest airport is Fresno, bearing 045, distance 47 miles. You're cleared direct, descend at pilot discretion. Morrison turned to Sarah. You were right. You heard it before any of our instruments caught it. How? Sarah didn't answer, focused on the engine instruments. The fire's out, but you've got fluid leaking. Probably a fuel line rupture that caused the fire. You need to declare a full emergency, not just priority handling. That leak could reignite. Morrison looked at her more carefully. You sound like you've handled this before. I've seen a few emergencies, Sarah said carefully. Price was working the radios and updating the flight attendants. We've got 143 passengers back there. Landing in Fresno on one engine. You'll be fine, Sarah said. Single engine landing is trained procedure. You've both done it in the simulator. Morrison began the descent, working with Price to configure the aircraft for landing. They were professionals, handling the emergency well, but Sarah could see the tension in their shoulders, the slight hesitation in their voices. Pacific 2847, Fresno approach. Runway 29 left is available, winds 310 at 12 knots. Emergency equipment is standing by. Cleared for visual approach runway 29 left, Morrison responded. They were at 10,000 feet now, descending through clear skies toward Fresno. The airport was visible ahead, and Morrison was setting up for a long, stable approach. That's when they heard it on the radio. A different frequency, military encrypted but patched through automatically. Pacific 2847, this is Viper 31, 2 F-22s scrambled from Fresno Air National Guard Base. We're at your 6 o'clock, 2 miles. We'll be monitoring your situation and providing escort to landing. Sarah's blood went cold. F-22s. Her aircraft. Her community. Morrison looked confused. Why would they scramble fighters for a single engine failure? The radio crackled again. Pacific 2847, we show a passenger manifest flag. Confirm you have a Sarah Chen on board. Sarah closed her eyes. The manifest flag. Her name was still in the system, still tagged for security monitoring because of her clearances and background. Any time she flew, military authorities were notified. Affirmative, we have Sarah Chen on board, Morrison replied. She's our maintenance observer. There was a pause. Then the voice came back, different now, more careful. Pacific 2847, can you confirm Sarah Chen's status? Is she safe? Any indication of hostile activity? Morrison glanced back at Sarah, confused. She's fine. She's helping us with the emergency. Why are you asking? Another pause. Then a different voice came on the radio, older, more authoritative. Pacific 2847, this is Colonel James Parker, Fresno Air National Guard. I need to speak with Sarah Chen directly. Morrison handed the headset to Sarah. Her hands were shaking as she put it on. This is Sarah Chen. Chen, this is Colonel Parker. I have your file in front of me. Former Air Force, F-22 pilot, call sign Shadow Hawk. You were cleared at the highest levels for classified operations. Your presence on an aircraft declaring an emergency triggered automatic security protocols. Are you under any duress? Sarah's voice was steady. No, sir. I'm a maintenance worker for Pacific Airlines. I'm on board as an observer. We have a legitimate mechanical emergency, engine fire and shutdown. No security issues. There was a long silence. Then Colonel Parker spoke again, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and respect. Shadow Hawk. The actual Shadow Hawk. You're working as a maintenance observer? Yes, sir. In the cockpit, both Morrison and Price had turned to stare at her. Behind her, a flight attendant who had entered the cockpit was frozen in place. The radio crackled with the voice of one of the F-22 pilots. Shadow Hawk, this is Viper 31, Captain Marcus Webb. Ma'am, I studied your tactics at the fighter weapons school. The mission over the Taiwan Strait where you took out 3 enemy fighters while your wingman was damaged. That's required study material now. It's an honor to provide escort, ma'am. The second F-22 pilot came on. Shadow Hawk, Viper 32, Captain Lisa Martinez. Ma'am, you trained my instructor at Nellis. He said you were the best stick and rudder pilot he ever flew with. We've got you covered all the way to the ground. Morrison found his voice. You're a fighter pilot. An F-22 pilot. And you're working maintenance. Sarah pulled off the headset. Former fighter pilot. I retired 3 years ago. Can we focus on landing this aircraft? But Morrison wasn't letting it go. Shadow Hawk. That call sign is famous. There are articles about your missions. You're a legend, and you're sitting in my jump seat in a maintenance uniform. Captain, we have an emergency to handle, Sarah said firmly. My background doesn't matter right now. You need to configure for landing. Price spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. Ma'am, should I call you ma'am? You outranked both of us. You're basically aviation royalty. Why didn't you say something when you got on board? Because I'm not a pilot anymore, Sarah said. I'm a mechanic. Now please, finish your approach checklist. Morrison and Price exchanged glances, then turned back to their instruments. But everything had changed. Sarah could see it in the way they sat up straighter, the way their hands moved more confidently across the controls. Morrison keyed his radio. Fresno approach, Pacific 2847 is configured for landing, single engine approach runway 29 left. Pacific 2847, you're cleared to land. Wind 310 at 14 knots. Emergency equipment is in position. They were at 3,000 feet now, on a perfect glide path. Morrison was flying well, keeping the speed steady, the descent rate consistent. But Sarah could see small corrections that weren't quite right, minor adjustments that were using more rudder than necessary. Captain, Sarah said quietly. You're overcorrecting for the asymmetric thrust. Relax your inputs. The aircraft will fly itself if you let it. Morrison nodded, and his next control inputs were smoother. The approach steadied. At 1,000 feet, Sarah saw the emergency vehicles lined up along the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, all positioned for worst-case scenarios. At 500 feet, Morrison called, stabilized. At 100 feet, the runway filled their view. The landing was smooth, professional. The main gear touched down first, then the nose gear, and Morrison deployed the thrust reverser on the good engine while carefully managing the rudder to keep the aircraft straight. They rolled out and came to a stop halfway down the runway. Emergency vehicles surrounded them immediately, fire crews spraying foam on the damaged engine as a precaution. Morrison pulled off his headset and turned to Sarah. "Thank you. If you hadn't heard that engine problem early, if you hadn't warned us to declare a full emergency, this could have been much worse." Sarah unbuckled from the jump seat. "You both handled it well. That's what matters." Price was staring at her with something like awe. "But you're Shadow Hawk. You're famous. Why are you working as a mechanic?" Before Sarah could answer, the cockpit door opened. The senior flight attendant stood there with tears in her eyes. "The passengers heard the radio calls. They heard the fighter pilots talking to you. They know who you are. They want to thank you." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't do anything special. You all did your jobs. That's what saved this flight." But when she stepped out of the cockpit, the entire cabin was standing. 143 passengers on their feet, some crying, all staring at her with expressions of shock and gratitude. A man in a business suit stepped forward. "You're Shadow Hawk. The fighter pilot. And you've been working as a mechanic?" "I work maintenance because I love aviation," Sarah said simply. "Now please, everyone sit down. We need to deplane safely." But they wouldn't sit. A woman holding a baby spoke up, her voice shaking. "You saved us. You heard the problem before anyone else. You kept everyone calm. You're a hero." "I'm a mechanic who did her job," Sarah said firmly. "Captain Morrison and First Officer Price are the ones who landed this aircraft safely. They're your heroes today." Morrison stepped out of the cockpit behind her. "That's not true. Without her experience, without her warning, we might not have caught the problem in time. She saved this flight." The passengers began applauding. The sound filled the cabin, loud and sustained. Sarah stood there, uncomfortable with the attention, wanting only to disappear back into her anonymous life. But that life was gone now. The secret was out. The debrief took 4 hours. FAA inspectors, airline officials, security personnel, and military liaisons all wanted statements. The engine failure was determined to be a manufacturing defect in the fuel line, the kind of rare failure that could happen despite perfect maintenance. The airline's chief pilot, a gray-haired man named Robert Chang, called Sarah into his office. "I just got off the phone with headquarters. They're very interested in your background. Former Air Force, F-22 pilot, multiple commendations. You've been working maintenance for 3 years and nobody knew. I applied for a maintenance position. I was qualified. Nobody asked about my previous career, so I didn't mention it." Chang leaned back in his chair. "Why maintenance? With your qualifications, any airline in the world would hire you as a pilot. Why are you turning wrenches instead of flying?" Sarah had prepared herself for this question, but it still hurt to answer. "I have a non-disclosure agreement related to my Air Force retirement. It may prevent me from flying commercially. I wasn't sure, so I took the safest option." "What kind of NDA prevents someone with your skills from flying?" "I can't discuss the details. That's what non-disclosure means." Chang studied her carefully. "Someone wanted to silence you. Someone used your career as leverage. That's the only reason someone like you ends up working maintenance." Sarah didn't respond. Chang picked up his phone. "I'm calling our legal department. If you're interested in flying again, we're going to fight whatever bureaucratic nonsense is keeping you on the ground. You deserve to be in a cockpit. I appreciate that, but..." "No buts. You saved 143 people today. You did it with skill and knowledge that comes from years of elite training. Pacific Airlines would be insane not to get you back in the air." The news media found her by that evening. Cameras and reporters gathered outside her apartment building, all wanting interviews with the legendary fighter pilot who had been working in secret as a mechanic. Her phone rang constantly. Text messages from former squadron members who had seen the news. Calls from aviation magazines. Emails from military history websites. Her brother David called, his voice excited. "Sarah. You're all over the news. Fighter pilot turned secret mechanic saves commercial flight. Mom and Dad are watching you on CNN right now. Mom's crying. She's so proud." "I didn't want this attention," Sarah said quietly. "I know, but Sarah, everyone's asking why you left the Air Force. Why you've been working maintenance. Maybe now you can finally tell people what really happened." "I can't. The NDA is still in effect." "That's garbage. You're a hero, and someone made you hide it. That's not right." Sarah ended the call and sat in her dark apartment, watching car headlights move across her ceiling. Everything had changed. The anonymous life she had built was destroyed. Everyone knew who she was now, and everyone wanted answers she couldn't give. 3 days later, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "This is Sarah." "Captain Chen, this is General Patricia Hawkins, Air Combat Command. I need to speak with you about your situation." Sarah sat up straight. General Hawkins was a legend herself, known for protecting her pilots and fighting for what was right. "Yes, ma'am. I've reviewed your file, including the sealed portions. I've also reviewed the investigation that led to your retirement. Captain Chen, what happened to you was wrong. You reported legitimate safety concerns, followed every proper procedure, and were punished for it by someone protecting his career and his son's career. That general has since been forced into retirement. His son is no longer flying. But you're still bound by an NDA that never should have been imposed." Sarah couldn't speak. 3 years of silence, 3 years of carrying the truth alone, and now someone in authority was saying she had been right. "I'm authorized to offer you 2 options," General Hawkins continued. "Full reinstatement to active duty with back pay for the 3 years you've been out. Or, if you prefer civilian flying, we'll void the non-disclosure agreement and provide documentation to any airline that your retirement was not for cause. Either way, we want you flying again." "I need time to think," Sarah managed to say. "Take whatever time you need. But Captain Chen, I want you to understand something. You were wronged by the system. That general used his influence to protect his son and punish you for doing the right thing. That's not acceptable. We want to make this right." After the call ended, Sarah sat on her couch for an hour, unable to process what had just happened. Everything she had lost was being offered back. The choice she thought was permanent was suddenly reversible. Her phone rang again. This time it was Captain Morrison from the flight. "Sarah, I hope I'm not bothering you. I wanted you to know that Captain Mitchell, the guy who usually flies that route, heard what happened. He said any pilot would be honored to fly with you. Amanda Price said the same thing. We all think you should be flying, not working maintenance." "Thank you, Rick. That means a lot. There's something else. The passengers from our flight have started a petition. They're asking Pacific Airlines to hire you as a pilot. Last I checked, it had over 10,000 signatures, and it's growing every hour. People want you in the cockpit where you belong." Sarah thanked him and ended the call. She walked to her window and looked out at the city lights. 3 years ago, she had walked away from flying to protect her principles. She had accepted invisibility and hard work rather than compromise her integrity. Now everyone was offering her a way back. The Air Force wanted her to return. Pacific Airlines was preparing a pilot position. The public was demanding she be allowed to fly. But who was she now? After 3 years of being invisible, after learning that her worth wasn't defined by flying, after finding purpose in maintenance work, did she still want to be a fighter pilot? Did she still want the glory and the recognition? She thought about Tommy Rodriguez, her fellow mechanic who worked hard to support his family. She thought about the young maintenance workers she had mentored, teaching them about aircraft systems and encouraging their dreams. She thought about the satisfaction of finding that cracked compressor blade, of preventing a potential disaster through careful inspection. That work mattered. That work saved lives just as surely as flying did. But she also remembered the feeling of takeoff, the joy of commanding an aircraft, the satisfaction of executing a perfect landing. She had loved flying more than anything else in the world. Could she really walk away from the chance to do it again? Sarah made her decision over the next week. She called General Hawkins first. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer to return to active duty. But I'm going to decline. I've spent 3 years learning to be someone other than a fighter pilot, and I've discovered I'm good at it. I'm valuable in ways that have nothing to do with flying fighters." "I understand," General Hawkins said. "But you're accepting the civilian flying option?" "Yes, ma'am. If Pacific Airlines wants to hire me, I'd like to fly for them. But I also want to continue working with maintenance training programs. I want to help break down the barriers between pilots and mechanics, improve communication, and recognize the value of the people who keep aircraft safe." General Hawkins laughed. "You're probably the only person I know who would turn down a return to flying F-22s so you can split time between commercial flying and maintenance training. But I understand. Good luck, Captain Chen." Sarah called Robert Chong next. "If the offer is still open, I'd like to accept the pilot position. But I have conditions." "Name them." "I want to work part-time as a pilot and part-time developing maintenance training programs. I want to create pathways for mechanics to advance into engineering or flight operations if that's their goal. I want to change how pilots and maintenance workers interact." Chong was quiet for a moment. "That's ambitious. It'll take time and money to develop those programs." "I know. But it's important. The people who keep aircraft safe deserve recognition and opportunities. I've worked with them for 3 years. I know how valuable they are." "All right. We'll make it work. Welcome to Pacific Airlines, Captain Chen." 6 months later, Sarah stood in a classroom wearing her pilot's uniform with 4 stripes on the shoulders. 20 maintenance workers sat in front of her, some skeptical, some curious, all watching carefully. She started by showing them a picture of herself in maintenance coveralls, covered in grease. "This was me 6 months ago. I worked maintenance for 3 years. I know what it's like to be invisible, to have people assume you're not important because you wear work clothes instead of a pilot uniform." She told them about the flight, about hearing the engine problem before the instruments caught it, about helping Captain Morrison and First Officer Price land safely. "I could do that because I had spent 3 years learning aircraft systems from the maintenance perspective. The pilots had simulator training for emergencies. I had real-world experience with how engines fail, how systems degrade, how problems develop. Both types of knowledge are valuable." A young mechanic raised his hand. "But you're Shadow Hawk. You're famous. You were always special. That doesn't apply to the rest of us." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not special. I'm a person who got good training and worked hard to develop skills. Every single one of you can do the same thing. What I want you to understand is that your work is not less important than flying. You are the reason aircraft fly safely. Every inspection you complete, every repair you make, that's what keeps people alive." She spent the next hour talking about career pathways, about programs Pacific Airlines was developing to help maintenance workers advance into engineering, flight operations, or specialized technical roles. She talked about respect, about breaking down the artificial barriers between different jobs. At the end of the class, an older mechanic approached her. "Captain Chen, I've been doing this work for 25 years. Nobody ever told me it was important before. They always treated pilots like heroes and mechanics like background workers. Thank you for saying we matter." Sarah shook his hand. "You do matter. Never forget that. She flew 3 days a week now, usually as first officer but occasionally as captain. She loved being back in the air, loved the challenge of flying, the satisfaction of a smooth landing. But she also loved her work with maintenance training, loved seeing mechanics advance into new roles, loved watching the culture change as pilots and mechanics began treating each other as equals. Captain Morrison requested to fly with her whenever possible. "You make me a better pilot," he told her. "You see things from angles I never considered. You understand the aircraft at a deeper level because of your maintenance experience." First Officer Price had become a close friend. "You're my role model," she said over coffee one day. "Not just because you're an amazing pilot, but because you chose to do the hard thing. You could have just accepted the pilot job and forgotten about maintenance work. But you didn't. You're using your position to help people who don't have your advantages." The F-22 pilots from Fresno stayed in touch. Captain Webb and Captain Martinez invited her to visit the base, to talk with young pilots about tactics and decision-making. When she arrived, wearing her Pacific Airlines uniform, the pilots gathered to meet her with obvious respect. "Shadow Hawk," Webb said, shaking her hand. "You're a legend in the fighter community. Everyone knows your name. But I have to ask, do you miss it? Do you miss flying fighters?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Sometimes. I loved flying F-22s. It was the most exciting, challenging work I've ever done. But I also love what I'm doing now. I'm flying, which I missed desperately. I'm teaching, which I'm good at. And I'm working to make aviation better for everyone. That matters more than personal glory." Martinez spoke up. "The story about you working as a mechanic for 3 years has changed how we treat our maintenance crews. We're more respectful now, more aware of how valuable their work is. You've influenced the entire military aviation community just by showing that the work is important regardless of who's doing it." A year after the emergency landing, Sarah was invited to speak at the International Aviation Safety Conference. The auditorium held 3,000 people, pilots, mechanics, safety inspectors, airline executives, military officers, and aviation students. She took the stage in her Pacific Airlines uniform and began with the story everyone knew. "A year ago, I was a mechanic on a flight that experienced an engine failure. When the emergency happened, my past as a military pilot became public. Everyone was shocked that someone with my background was working maintenance. But here's what I want you to understand, the lesson isn't that I was special and people should have recognized it. The lesson is that everyone deserves respect regardless of their job title." She talked about the 3 years she spent being invisible, about being dismissed and overlooked, about having people make assumptions based on her work clothes. "I was the same person in maintenance coveralls that I am in this pilot uniform. My worth as a human being didn't change. Only your perception changed." She described the culture she was working to build at Pacific Airlines, where pilots and mechanics collaborated as equals, where communication flowed freely, where everyone's expertise was valued. "We've seen safety improvements, better problem solving, and increased job satisfaction across all departments. It turns out that when you treat people with respect and recognize their value, they perform better." The audience was silent, absorbed in her words. Sarah continued. "The next time you see someone in a work uniform, I want you to remember that you have no idea who they are, what they know, or what they've accomplished. Treat them with respect, not because they might secretly be a fighter pilot, but because they're a human being doing important work." She finished to a standing ovation, but what mattered more were the conversations afterward. Maintenance workers who thanked her for advocating for them. Pilots who admitted they had never considered the perspective she described. Executives who wanted help changing their organizational cultures. Sarah continued flying and teaching for years. She trained hundreds of pilots and maintenance workers, all of whom carried forward her lessons about respect, collaboration, and the importance of seeing every person's full humanity. The maintenance training program she developed became a model for the aviation industry. Workers with aptitude and interest were given paths to flight training, engineering positions, or specialized technical roles. Communication protocols between cockpits and hangars were improved. Safety metrics got better as barriers between different jobs were removed. She never forgot what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to have people assume she wasn't important. And she used that memory to ensure that others didn't have to experience the same thing. 10 years after the emergency landing, Sarah sat in a cockpit preparing for takeoff. She was flying as captain now, with a young first officer who had started as a maintenance worker and advanced through the training program Sarah had created. "Captain Chen," the first officer said. "I just want to thank you. I was working in the hangar when you gave your first talk about career pathways. I never thought someone like me could become a pilot. But you made it possible." Sarah smiled. "You made it possible. You did the work, passed the tests, and earned your wings. I just helped open the door." As they climbed through the clouds toward cruise altitude, Sarah thought about her journey. From fighter pilot to mechanic to commercial pilot to advocate for change. It hadn't been the path she expected, but it had been the right one. She had lost her career as Shadow Hawk, had spent 3 years in obscurity, had faced prejudice and dismissal. But she had learned that her worth wasn't defined by her job title or her call sign. She had learned that all work has dignity, that all people deserve respect, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is use your privilege to help others. The radio crackled. "Pacific 4729, contact departure." "Pacific 4729, departure," Sarah responded. She was Shadow Hawk once, a name spoken with awe and respect. Now she was Captain Sarah Chen, a pilot who remembered what it meant to be invisible and who worked every day to ensure that others were seen, valued, and respected. And that, she thought as she leveled off at cruise altitude, was a legacy worth leaving.